Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. Is empathy real, and does it matter? That could be another way of framing the questions of the past few episodes. My more considered way of expressing that would have been to ask whether empathy is a quality of the divine or whatever is ultimately real, and whether it factors in ethical equations for human life, or to use the other words I've landed on, are there ontological and existential dimensions of empathy? As I was concluding the last episode, I identified what I thought would be my next destination on the trail through the land of empathy and its connection with ultimate reality, particularly the divine. And that trail leads through various types of theism, atheism or non-theism, pantheism, and monotheism, so far at least. I said my next stop would be what is called panentheism, with Christianity as the region in focus. In passing, I said I might mention polytheism briefly in the process. And yet, as often happens, things took an unexpected turn. While preparing what I thought would be brief comments about polytheism, I kept finding more things I felt needed to be said. And in the end, this episode became all about polytheism. But first, a little detour. Recently, one of my regular listeners asked me if I plan to elaborate on any of the topics that arise during these episodes. That is something that I'm thinking about for the future, but meanwhile, there is another way to explore further some of the themes that I look at here. If you've listened to even a few episodes, you know that two features of the Cow Behind the Barn podcast, as I ask questions about the nature of the world and myself and the divine, are my interspiritual approach to the major religions of the world, and then the way I weave my own art into the mix. A simpler way to label these two elements of the podcast is to say I explore spirituality and creativity together as I look at big questions about the cosmos and who we are and whatever it is people have called the divine or the sacred or ultimate reality. So I've worked on an entire course that actually explores this intersection of creativity and spirituality, spirituality and creativity, art and religion, religion and art. It's an online course called Wisdom for Artists from Ancient Wells, and it's really a journey of discovery, exploring the creative, spiritual, and relational essence of our nature as human beings, drawing water from the wells of 6 major spiritual heritages: Moses and the Bhagavad Gita, Buddha, Lao Tzu, Jesus, Muhammad. There are 7 in-depth reflections on each of those 6 wells. There are creative practices that are offered, and there's opportunities to share with others your own creative work, either as part of a cohort community, moving through the material together, or in a self-paced model. In addition to deeper experiential insights into Moses and the Gita, the Buddha and Lao Tzu and Jesus and Muhammad, by the end of the course, most participants end up with at least 6 fresh creative works: poems, paintings, drawings, songs, fresh creative inspiration for their roles as teachers, professional lives, parents, the art of being human. In addition, it might be a chance for you and I to meet as well. At least I would hope so. Now, I helped in the development of the Ancient Wells course in my role as a co-founder of the Table Collective, which you've heard me mention in the introduction to every Cow Behind the Barn episode. And if you've been enjoying the Cow Behind the Barn, I think Ancient Wells may be something you would appreciate as well. And if that interests you, there's more information on our Table Collective website at tablecollective.art. I hope to see you. All right, back to the Cow Behind the Barn and this trail of theisms that I've been on. I mentioned a few moments ago that I assumed I would skim over polytheism quickly. But just as in episode 1, when I talked about the surprises of crawling around on the floor looking for lost toys with my granddaughter, so too, here I was surprised by what I found with polytheism, or rather I was surprised maybe by my own ignorance about that. As I said way back in episode 1, it's amazing what you find when you don't find what you're looking for. As with every theism, there is actually a lot to say about polytheism, and a lot to say that I won't have the space to include here. Since my purpose is to explore whether empathy is a quality of reality, including whether it is a quality of divine reality, I'll use that narrower purpose to focus my attention, which means that when I approach polytheism, I have two questions. One, what is polytheism's view of ultimate reality? And then two, what's the source of ethics in polytheistic worldviews, including any ethical elements directly or indirectly connected with empathy? I'll take those one at a time. So first, ultimate reality and polytheism, with a big question mark. Polytheism, obviously, is a type of theism, and within theism, it contrasts both with monotheism, the belief in a singular supreme deity, and with pantheism, the view that ultimately the divine is the only reality. Polytheism is, of course, the belief that there is more than one divine being, often a pantheon of gods and goddesses, often worshipped or served or consulted for help by means of ceremonies and rituals intended usually for a specific divinity, at least at any given time. Now, how many gods? What are they like? How is their nature or natures, the nature of ultimate reality connected to all of that? The answers to such questions depend a lot upon which type of polytheism we're looking at. And I can't look at all the types. So I'm going to begin with describing polytheism in three different ways. I'm going to describe it briefly from a cultural perspective, the context from which different versions of polytheism come from. I'm going to describe it in what we might call a theological perspective, the types of deities often found in polytheism, and then typological. That's the word I'm using to describe the sorts of categories given to different types of polytheism by philosophers of religion and, in some cases, anthropologists. So first, the cultural description of polytheism. And again, this has to be a rather broad overview and somewhat in random order as these came to me. Here are some of the sort of families of polytheistic religions. There are Egyptian and Roman and South Asian and East Asian families of polytheism. There are Eurasian and families of polytheism in the Americas. There's European and Scandinavian and Celtic and African. And there's also modern neo-pagan examples of polytheism. And in that family, some would include things, for example, like Wicca. That list gives only a glimpse into the complexity of the matter, because there are some examples of polytheism not on the list that I'm sure I'm missing. And in addition, leaving aside the missing examples, just within each of those that are on my list, there is a wide variety of polytheistic expressions inside each of those. I can't obviously elaborate each of the differences, but I can list examples of the types of deities which we might find, which takes me to the next way to describe polytheism, what I've called the theological description. This list will also be incomplete and somewhat random. I'm not presenting a list of the names of the different deities, but that, of course, varies depending on which cultural context that they functioned within. But here's a list of examples of the types of divinities and gods found in different polytheistic worldviews. There are creators, although not supreme creators. That would be monotheistic. There's heroes. There are gods and goddesses of death. There are gods and goddesses of life, death, and rebirth, love, mother goddesses, father goddesses, royal gods and goddesses. There are solar, I think I said father goddesses just a minute ago. I hope you caught that, and forgive me for that. There's solar gods and goddesses, lunar, celestial, in other words, the sky itself perhaps, or different planets, land and different aspects of land, mountains, etc., rivers, oceans, other kinds of water, rain, weather, etc. And there are also, at least in some examples, there are gods and goddesses of the different arts that we find, or technologies, we might say today as well, in different representations that human beings have come up with. There's another one that might be worthy of mention as well. It's rather common to find some sort of divinity within the different forms of polytheism that might be known in different ways as the trickster. Now, in practice, polytheists don't express devotion to all the gods in their various pantheons. The mere scope would make that impossible. Instead, worship and devotion tends to be focused upon one or a few, perhaps, sometimes as an ongoing general practice in which a devotee chooses one or a few gods for special attention and devotion through the course of life, and sometimes it depends on the need of the moment. For example, when a devotee, of a celestial divinity makes an offering to a water divinity prior to perhaps crossing a river or taking a voyage on an ocean. Well, that brings me then to typological descriptions of polytheism after this overview of sort of the cultural backgrounds and then the different kinds of divinities. In broad terms, what types of polytheism emerge? Of course, it involves the worship of multiple deities, but some forms don't necessarily deny the existence of a single ultimate source. Polytheistic belief systems grapple with the concept of ultimate reality in various ways. One dividing line, though, in the way that ultimate reality might be seen in polytheism is a distinction which anthropologists and philosophers of religion categorize as hard versus soft polytheism. So let me explain those. This is a key distinction, and it makes a huge difference in the answers to the questions that I'm seeking. Hard polytheism emphasizes that each deity is truly a separate, real, distinct being. There are, of course, different types of hard polytheism. As I mentioned above, it's common for a devotee to select one or perhaps a few of the gods for specific allegiance, and this can take the form of what is called henotheism, which acknowledges multiple deities but focuses on the worship of one that is considered higher than the other gods in stature, not in terms of being the source of anything, which would be an example of monotheism, but really just in terms of this is the supreme God for me. This is the preferred god or goddess for me. I would call this practical monotheism, I guess, because it's a monotheism in practice. Yes, I know there's other ones, but for me and in my experience and in my interaction, there's one. That's henotheism. In addition to henotheism, hard polytheism can also be expressed in what might be called monolatry. This is similar to henotheism in the sense that, in this case, the devotee selects one god or goddess, but that devotee chooses to worship a single deity within a pantheon without denying others, without, however, the assumption that the god they choose for worship is supreme in comparison with the others. So henotheism might see them as supreme in practice. Monolatry is just focusing on the one to the exclusion of all the others. Again, it's not a hard and fast distinction. The key here is that hard polytheism recognizes multiple deities as distinct beings which truly exist. As such, the gods are not metaphors for or names of the different attributes of a supreme divinity, which if they were simply just the names for a distinct divinity, that actually starts to take us in the direction of monotheism. Nor are the gods and their qualities ways of speaking of an all-pervading force or spirit or divine essence, which begins to take us in the direction of pantheism. Nor are the gods, to use a theory that's much more contemporary in its development, projections of different aspects of human nature and human experience and behavior. That type of polytheism begins to take us perhaps in the direction of atheism, or at least could live within an atheistic worldview quite comfortably. So that's some reflections about hard polytheism. Before I go on to soft polytheism, I want to pause here for a reflection on this as an artist. Hard polytheism, in other words, as an artist. My poem, Myths and Gods, was written years ago. It's published in my book of poems titled, like the podcast, The Cow Behind the Barn. In the creative process, I tried to imagine my way into what I now realize is hard polytheism, a hard polytheistic world. Specifically here, the Greek world of Homer and the entangled relationships of the gods and human beings with all the tragedy and pathos of that interconnection, and with the frank depictions of the vulnerabilities of the gods. I'm really presenting it here just as an invitation to sort of feel all of that along with me, what it might be like to live in a hard polytheistic world. So here's the poem, Myths and Gods. Myths and Gods. There's a mist growing, darkening the eyes of the gods, rising from the plains beside the waters of Scamandros. The ground is dark with riverlets of blood, black immortal nectar from Olympian veins. Agamemnon, finally a leader, lord of men, stands above the bleeding wreckage. Battle boasts surrender to birds and beasts preying on the dead flesh of Athena, Apollo, and Achilles. Zeus is in the arms of Hera, dead. The Greeks ride in victory, singing of conquest and swinging swords above their heads. Agamemnon is a conqueror. Ajax defeats Odysseus, and Paris chooses a wardrobe for the slaying of the gods. Now, I admit I found the poem more evocative now, at this season in my life, than when I first wrote it years ago. And I'm not sure if it resonated in that way with you, but I just feel a lot of almost loneliness with it. At any rate, I want to move on now to soft polytheism. Soft polytheism tends to view the deities of a pantheon as manifestations or aspects, perhaps of a single overarching god, or of a greater all-pervading essence of some sort, or spirit of some sort. I went to some pains to show how hard polytheism did not end up being a type of one of the other theisms, pantheism or monotheism, but now I'm going to explain how soft polytheism does end up that way. One type of soft polytheism views the different gods as metaphorical representations or aspects of a supreme deity. In other words, monotheism. As an aside, what is often called pluralism in theological circles is very similar to this kind of soft polytheism, at least functionally. What I mean is that pluralism not only sees all religious systems and theological frameworks as equally valid, but also tends to view each religion's names for God and concepts of God as different ways of referring to and calling upon the same being, rather than as actually different gods. And that's very similar to this type of soft polytheism. In other forms of soft polytheism, the gods are viewed as aspects or emanations, perhaps, of a transcendent absolute principle or spirit or essence, which is immanent in all things. So transcendent in the sense of bigger than what we experience in daily life, but immanent in that it's in all those things. And the gods are immanent, almost like expressions, radiations, metaphorical representations of all of that. So this is very close to pantheism. In fact, when people refer to the Bhagavad Gita as an example of polytheism, they're correct in some ways, at least if by that they mean this kind of soft polytheism, where the gods ultimately really represent one essence, one in the vocabulary of the Gita, big S, self, or big A, Atman. Given that I have focused on both pantheism and monotheism already, and that different types of soft polytheism in the end are in fact expressions of one or the other of those two, I think it will be more valuable to focus my time in this episode by looking at hard polytheism in terms of my question about the relationship between empathy and ultimate reality. But I'm not done with soft polytheism. Later in the episode, I'll include a creative offering that I might say seems most at home in a soft polytheistic way of seeing things. But for now, hard polytheism and empathy. Now, by narrowing my question in this way, I find I immediately run into a problem. the question of the nature of ultimate reality is actually left unanswered by hard polytheistic examples of polytheism. So where does that leave me in terms of my main question? If hard polytheism doesn't have a consistent view of what is really real beyond the worlds of humans and nature and the gods, where do I turn to find the answer as to where empathy fits into the nature of ultimate reality? I'm going to start from the question of whether there is a ground and source for ethics in polytheism, and if so, what that might be, and then work back from that to my bigger question. To use the terms that I coined in previous episodes, then, I'm going to start from the existential questions of empathy and work back to see if there is anything ontological in them. So, polytheism and ethics. In my research, I came across a very helpful, long piece about polytheism in Britannica, which surveyed multiple examples of polytheism and its historical developments and much more. It was global in scope, explored beliefs, rituals, almost everything. In fact, everything except one thing, ethics. However, that doesn't mean that polytheism can't provide a grounding for ethics, nor that polytheists have no ethical frameworks. So where do those frameworks come from? Polytheism sometimes draws ethical guidelines from the behavior and teaching of the gods. Polytheistic pantheons include deities with specific attributes and behaviors which can serve as examples for humans to emulate. The stories of the gods tell of moral dilemmas and choices which can be seen as examples of right and wrong. However, many of the stories of the gods include, bad choices made by different deities in the face of the dilemmas that they face, and thus reveal questionable ethical behavior on the parts of the gods. And this raises the question, how do we as humans decide which example to follow? Which is virtuous or morally exemplary? In some cases, polytheistic deities may have given human beings guidance through sacred texts or oracles or other divine manifestations. And in such cases, there's something other than the actions of the gods, then, to guide moral wisdom for humans. There's the moral teaching of the gods, even if the gods don't follow it themselves, we might say. It shouldn't be surprising to find that there would be different systems of ethical wisdom, given the poly in polytheism. And that is the case. Different deities have different ethical and, I would add, unethical behaviors and responses to things. However, there are some polytheistic traditions which have incorporated philosophical and moral frameworks that emphasize more universal values like reason, justice, and compassion. For example, some Greek versions of polytheism incorporated the philosophical framework of Stoicism. We might see this as a way of incorporating some sort of a natural order that governs the universe and human behavior, similar in some ways, to the Tao of Lao Tzu. And in such cases, right ethical conduct would be understood as aligning with that natural order. Even in cases where such a universal principle is not present, there can be a positive aspect in the polyethics of polytheism. Given that the source of ethics in polytheism includes a number of divine models and human traditions, universal principles, philosophical insights, ethics within a polytheistic framework can result, not necessarily, but it can result in a more nuanced understanding of how to apply morality than in at least some applications of monotheistic ethical frameworks, because the latter tend to develop single codes assumed to be universal in the sense of applying in the same way in all places, at all times, for all situations, for all people. Whereas the more poly nature of polytheistic ethics enables somebody to realize that different situations may call for different principles, or those may need to be applied in different ways in different situations. As a result of the more universal aspects within polytheistic ethics and even accounting for the nuanced variations, one thing I have noticed during my research is the fact that polytheistic religions share common ethical principles with other belief systems, including principles such as love, compassion, justice, and respect for others, without necessarily identifying where those come from. Now, let me try to zero in here a little more narrowly on empathy, because principles like compassion and justice and respect are not, as we've seen, equal to empathy. Polytheistic myths do sometimes tell stories of divine empathy and at least compassion, but these don't seem to be qualities that are shared throughout the pantheons, nor are they always abiding qualities in the moral character of a particular deity. Now, let me elaborate on this. First, many polytheistic religions have specific deities who are specifically associated with kindness and care for their people, while other deities don't share that characteristic at all, or to a lesser extent. There's a difference between compassion being the quality of some of the divine beings and compassion being a divine quality across the board. That's the main point I want to put here when I'm trying to discern whether empathy is a quality of ultimate reality in a polytheistic worldview or framework. Second, there are examples of specific deities who are sometimes kind, but not as an abiding feature of their own nature. Zeus, for example, at times exhibits compassion, but he's often portrayed as a powerful tyrant. Now, all of this has yet to answer whether empathy is an element of the divine character really in either sense. There may be examples here and there, but it's really unclear to see if empathy is a quality of the divine character, either as a quality of specific deities in a sort of ongoing way, as opposed to others in a pantheon, or as a quality in a particular deity, even if it only shows up now and then. I do see compassion and kindness, yes, within the limitations just outlined, but empathy, as we're using the term, I won't say it isn't there, but I haven't found it. That doesn't mean that polytheistic ethicists might not advocate for empathy as a core ethical and thus existential facet of an ethical system. And while I don't think one can make the case for it as an ontological element, as an ingredient grounded in the nature of things as they are, that doesn't mean that ethics and philosophy within a polytheistic framework can't result in a more ontological grounding for empathy. Let me just give one example, given my time limitation. I mentioned Stoicism above as an example of a larger, more universal framework or principle wedded to polytheistic traditions within the Greek world. That wedding results in a type of the soft polytheism I discussed earlier, and as such, this seems a good place to include the creative offering that I mentioned. But before saying that, the point I'm trying to make here is that Stoicism is an example in which a polytheistic system found another way to ground questions of ethics in ultimate reality. It wasn't inherent in Hellenistic Greek polytheistic traditions, but when wedded to the philosophy of Stoicism, it begins to open the possibility of ethics and therefore perhaps empathy being grounded in something deeper than just the actions or attributes of certain specific gods or their teachings. However, let me now come back to soft polytheism before I start to wrap some things up. And Stoicism is an example, actually, ultimately of a soft polytheistic framework. But typically, I first explain something in an episode and then include an artistic expression. But in this case, I'm actually offering the art before I go into a more elaborate explanation of the conceptual framework that I was just trying to summarize a moment ago. The art here in this case is a song titled Shimmer, and it's actually streaming on all the different normal platforms as well if you want to re-listen to it. But first, without a lot of introduction, let me just present the song Shimmer. There's auras in the attics. There's spirits in the dawn. There's something living out in the black holes. The tongues of angels are singing in our songs. There's a glowing inside the dry leaves, a steady breathing underground. And there's laughter in the stones of mountains. Eyes of light and fire watch all around us. I shiver with a longing, shaking with a hunger. I shimmer in the silence of the living, flaming temple carved deep inside me. Beyond the shapes of cats in my windowsill, the barren lands, tombstone hills, I see a crimson new day dawn, sent here to find me. I've been fired in a furnace, tempered by cold and burn. I've been hammered out on an anvil, my leathered skin the map of every road I've traveled. I'm stacks of stones in quarries mined, some treasure, others left behind, time grinding all our treasures down to gravel. There's auras in the attics and there's spirits in the dawn. There's something living out in the black holes, tongues of angels singing in our songs. There's a glowing inside the dry leaves, steady breathing underground, laughter in the stones of mountains, and eyes of light and fire watch all around us. Sunlight in the shadows and moonbeams in the dawn. I see morning's giddy madness, all dressed in flame and dancing in wild abandon. I grab my hat and join the line, move my heavy feet to keep the time with the rhythm inside us all, down in deep canyons. There's auras in the attics and spirits in the dawn. Something's living out in the black holes, tongues of angels singing in our songs. There's a glowing inside the dry leaves, steady breathing underground, laughter in the stones of mountains, and eyes of light and fire watch all around us. They watch us shimmer, we are shimmering. We shimmer with all that's shimmering, and all is shimmering, and we are shimmering. We shimmer with all that shimmers, all is shimmering, and we shimmer with all that shimmers. We shimmer, we shimmer. Now, what might be the relationship between empathy and ultimate reality if something like soft polytheism were true? So I'll come back now to Stoicism. Stoicism, when we commonly use the term, is often depicted as if it were the opposite of compassion and caring and empathy. For example, she remained stoic in the face of tragedy is an example of a way we commonly use the term stoic. It reveals that common idea that being stoic is some sort of emotionless resilience. And while Stoicism does focus on cultivating emotional control, it doesn't mean that it can't also foster empathy. True, Stoics aim to manage emotions and seek clear, rational ways of understanding the world, but Stoicism also encourages self-awareness, examination of our thoughts and feelings and biases, and this can increase our ability to understand others more fully and more deeply, which is already beginning to pull us towards empathy. Stoics focus on cultivating virtues which can lead to more compassionate, empathetic behaviors. For example, acting in ways that benefit society as a whole requires empathy in order to understand what would be of benefit to others. In keeping with this, Stoicism emphasizes actively listening to others' thoughts and emotions, even if they differ from our own, in order to treat others with gentleness and kindness. All of this encourages human beings to act in ways that are kind, compassionate, just, and, yes, ultimately, empathetic. It encourages at least existential empathy. But what of ontological empathy? And that's really, as you know, one of the core questions that I have. What is the relationship of empathy, if any, to ultimate reality? It's true that polytheism can include empathy as something ontological, an aspect of the essential nature of a specific divine being. And as in the case of Stoicism, there's instances where empathy can be argued to be part of a natural order, which is actually more real or ultimate than the specific gods. However, the fact remains that in polytheism, empathy is not generally or commonly something I would understand to be an ontological reality, a characteristic of what really is. So where does that leave things as I come to the conclusion of this episode? With the exception of polytheism, my exploration of the connection between reality and empathy in the various theisms, atheism or non-theist, pantheist, monotheist, suggests that there is a common thread which stitches empathy into the very fabric of ultimate reality. And in the cases of pantheism and monotheism, that ultimate reality is, of course, seen as divine. And now, after my unexpectedly longer detour into polytheism, in which I have discovered that there is not really a strong case to be made for empathy as an aspect of ultimate reality, I am ready to go back to what I thought was the main trail and take up the final theism on my list, panentheism, which will bring me to Christian views of all of this, all of which I'll explore next time.